I wanted to start off this morning just to share a little geography lesson. We're going to talk about this island called Igloo Lick. I know it sounds interesting, Igloo Lick. But anyways, it's in northern Canada. It's in the Arctic Circle. And this island of Igloo Lick, the average temperature there is negative 20 degrees. We get really grumpy when it's like 30 degrees, and we're kind of like, oh, I can't wait for summer, and it's negative 20 there on average. Pretty crazy, right? It's in the tundra, right? So it's an ever-changing landscape. It's barren, snow drifts that change all the time. It's easy to get lost. And so Igloo Lick is located there, but the people living on Igloo Lick, the Inuit, have amazed scholars and researchers for centuries because for thousands of years, these people have ventured out into the tundra where it's dangerous, you can get lost, and yet they find their way back. They have this innate ability that they pass down called wayfinding, and basically it's an ability to judge the animal behaviors, the stars, wind patterns, snowdrift patterns, tides, all that kind of stuff, and it's all wrapped in this ability to find their way back home. They don't use compasses, they've never used maps, and so it's intrigued scholars for centuries. But recently, as technology has advanced and it has advanced up to Igloo Lick, the people have started to rely a lot more on compasses and satellite maps. And as a result, there have been a lot more accidents and incidents that have happened because as you're riding your snowmobile out into the tundra, you're paying attention to your GPS and all of a sudden it fails you, and you don't know how to find your way back. And so you plot out a map on your satellite map, you plot out a course, this is where we're going to go to hunt, and you find yourself surrounded by thin ice because you weren't watching for the signs to make sure that you were on safe ground. And so the reality is that there's a generation on Igloo Lick within the Inuit people who are losing this ability that has puzzled and astonished scholars and researchers for years, and in a single generation it could evaporate, this wayfinding ability. Now, the reason I share that story is because I see something similar in Judges chapter 2. In Judges chapter 2, we see the people of Israel who, are God's chosen people. He brought them out of Egypt, out of slavery and bondage, with a mighty hand, with an outstretched arm. He brought them out of Egypt, and he gave his commands, his covenant to them, and they agreed to the terms of the covenant and said, we will love and serve you only, God. And so here we have the people of Israel. That's their identity of who they are. And yet we find in them a situation similar to what's happening to the Inuit on Igloo Lick, is that there arose a generation that did not know the Lord. This is what we read in Judges chapter 2. I'm just going to read it. If you want to follow along with me, if you have one of the black Bibles in the back, it's on page 201. But I'm just going to read verses 6 through 12 just to get us into where we're going to be talking about today. When Joshua dismissed the people of Israel, they each went to their inheritance to take possession of the land. And the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great work that the Lord had done for Israel. And Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110 years. And they buried him within the boundaries of his inheritance in Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of the mountains of Gash. And all that generation also were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. In verse 11, and the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They served the Baals. They abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the people who were around them, and they bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. And so what we see here in this situation is, if we read the Old Testament, we see what God did on behalf of the Israelite people, right? Of all people that we read about in the Bible, we would think we would never read these words about the people of Israel, that a generation arose who didn't know what the Lord had done for them, that didn't know the Lord or serve him, and that did evil in the sight of the Lord by serving other gods. We would think, no, of all people, that wouldn't be true of the people of Israel. But this is the words we read in Judges chapter 2. And it might be tempting for us to sit in judgment and say, man, those Israelites, they're a bunch of knuckleheads. Like, yeah, they were always doing this. And, we could cast stones at them and we could say, well, we could smack our head and just say, it is what it is. That's the people of Israel. And yes, they had their flaws, they had their faults, but I think that we would be wrong to sit in judgment and not take warning of what Judges chapter 2 describes. Why do I say that? I want to give us some statistics to kind of set the parameters of what we're going to be talking about today. The first statistic is that 3 out of 4 teenagers, when they graduate from high school, leave the church. I'm not meaning that they go to a different church because they're at college or something like that. I mean they leave the Christian faith. 3 out of 4 students. Second statistic, the current generation, Generation Z, the population of Generation Z, Ers, I don't know if that's a term, but we'll just call it that. The population of Generation Zers that ascribe to atheistic beliefs is double that of the population of adults in the United States who ascribe the same belief. And so we're really looking at the first post-Christian culture in America. The Barna Group also has done studies where with each successive generation, the percentage of Christians in each of those generations is in the decline, and it has been for years. And so really what we're looking at, if we take all of this together and we take notice of what Judges 2 is telling us, is that we're really looking at Judges chapter 2 unfolding before our very eyes. And the question I want us to ask and to continually ask as we go through the message today, as we think about these things, is will we, the church of today, not just this church, but the church of today, will we be the church that goes down in infamy like the people of Israel in Judges 2, who allowed a generation to arise who did not know the Lord? Will that be said of us 100 years, 200 years? If the Lord tarries down the road, will that be said of us? That we were a generation that allowed another generation to arise who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done. So maybe you're here and you're like, okay, great. The youth guy, he's talking about youth ministry stuff. I can check out because this doesn't apply to me. And you're like, all right, I'm done. He always does this. Okay, if that's you, don't do it. Don't do it, because I don't think that there's anybody here who is not in some way, shape, or form connected to somebody in the next generation. So this applies to you. It applies to all of us. And we need to know as a church how we can take steps to reach that next generation so there won't be another generation to arise who doesn't know the Lord or the work that he has done. And so I've titled the message, There Arose Another Generation. And I want to share with you 2, I think, important influencers the Bible talks about when it talks about passing on faith to the next generation. So 2 important influencers that we're going to look at, and we're going to look at these in Deuteronomy chapter 6 and chapter 7. So if you have one of the black Bibles, you can, or if in your other Bible, just flip back 2 books. You'll go backwards, Joshua, then to Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 6 is on page 151 of the black Bibles in back. And so we're going to look at these 2 important influencers. The first important influencer is families. So important influencer number 1, families. So let's read Deuteronomy 6, 1 through 9. Excuse me. Now this is the commandment, the statutes and the rules that the Lord your God commanded me to teach you, that you may do them in the land to which you are going over to possess it, that you may fear the Lord your God, you and your son and your son's sons, by keeping all of his statutes and his commandments, which I commanded you, all the days of your life, and that your days may be long. Hear therefore, O Israel, be careful to do them, that it may go well with you, that you may multiply greatly as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has promised you in a land flowing with milk and honey. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you arise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. And so what this is talking about is this important influencer in faith transmission is families. And if we look at Deuteronomy chapter 7, it talks about that we should teach those commandments that should be on our hearts, right? So talking about an internal, commitment, devotion, that there's a priority going on there, that faith is a priority that is written on our hearts, that our faith is a deep held seat within us, within our being, and that within our hearts, from that outflow, we should then teach those things diligently to our children. It's talking about the transmission of faith and the diligence that families have and the importance that families have in passing on that faith. Now, if we look at what verse 7 says, that there's two pairs of opposites. It says, you shall teach them diligently to your children, talk of them, when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise. Those two pairs of opposites basically are stating that in every activity, at any time, at any place, that faith transmission is to be occurring within the context of the family. Now, it shouldn't come as a surprise that this is what Deuteronomy is saying, because if we take the context of this passage and of the book, it was written to a people who were within a farming community, right? You lived on a plot of land with your family, you worked the land, and that plot of land passed from generation to generation. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that the family was that most important faith influencer in the life of the context of the people of Israel. Although there were priests, there were teachers, this is true, but the importance of faith transmission is being said here in Deuteronomy 6, that it is placed upon the family unit, that faith transmission, the important influencer, the first influencer is the family. And I want to illustrate this with a visual that I think really helps to explain this a little bit. In the book, Think Orange, Reggie Joyner, who's a longtime youth ministry, talked about the two kind of realities that we see of where time lies and how much time and influence that specific groups of people have. And so this first container represents time and influence that the church has. This is 40 M&Ms. I counted them. They're literally 40. I may have ate some, but I still counted these as 40. So there are 40 M&Ms held within this container. This represents the amount of time that a church has with a student on average. So a child, a teenager, young adult, 40 hours on average a year that a church has to influence and impact the next generation. So that's our first reality. The second reality that I want to draw our attention to is this container. Now, I couldn't fit it all in one. I was really trying to. I don't know if I could have found something bigger and you still could have saw all the M&Ms. But just a side note, I did not count these, literally. But I did take the approximate average on the back of servings and then did the math and all that. So within these containers, there should be basically 3,000 M&Ms. 3,000 M&Ms. This represents the amount of time in hours on average that parents have with their children. So this should illustrate a couple different things for us. The first thing is I tell this to parents. Whenever we have parents meeting, I say this. And if you haven't heard me say it, you weren't listening. Because parents, you are the most important youth leader in the life of your children. Time is influence, and you have a lot of it. You may not feel like it if you have teenagers. You may not feel like it. You may feel like they're not listening to me. But time is influence, and you have the most time in influence with your children. And so you are the most important faith transmitter in the life of your child. Now, the second reality that this also helps us to understand is this. If you are of the belief that it is the job of the church to train your child in the training and the instruction of the Lord, there's only so much time and influence that's happening here. Yes, there's still a role that the church plays, and we'll get to that because that'll be part of our later discussion. But this is the amount of time that we as a church have with a child, with a teenager. Time is influence. And if faith transmission is only happening during this time frame, it's just simply inadequate. So what I think that this illustrates and what Deuteronomy 6 is telling us, it's the importance of the family in transmitting faith to the next generation. Now, I think that this plays out in a couple different ways. Because how does that play out in the life of family? I can just say, okay, family, you guys, you got to transmit the faith. But then if I'm not talking about how that occurs, then we're not really putting meat to the bones of this. And so how does this play out? Well, I think it plays out in two different realms, and I think they kind of blend together. So I'm going to give them to you up front, so you can write them down if you want to, but then we'll just go back to one, and then we can kind of go through it, okay? So it plays out in two areas where faith transmission occurs in the family. The first is in family priorities, and then the second is family practices, right? So family priorities, family practices. We'll talk about family priorities first. So in Deuteronomy 6, in verse 4, it says, or in verse 5, it says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might, right? This is what Moses is encouraging. He's saying that is priority number one in the life of a person who is part of the community of Israel. Priority number one, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Jesus echoes these same words in Matthew 22 when he's asked, what's the greatest commandment? And Jesus says, the first and the greatest is, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And then he says, the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And he says, on these two hang all the law and the prophets. So Jesus says, priority number one, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. God should be priority number one, and the love of God should be the focus of the follower of Jesus. Now, we say I love things a lot, right? This can get lost in translation. Like, I love M&Ms. I love water. I love that poinsettia. So the reality is we could say I love, but there's many different layers of love. What does that mean? Well, to love God should be understood as exclusive and total devotion to Him. That's what loving God is. Priority one, exclusive and total devotion to Him. So my question, how does this play out in family priorities, in the life of the family who is seeking to live out the Christian faith? Family priorities, families, where are your priorities in the life of your family? Is loving God, exclusive and total devotion to Him, is loving God to the extent that He deserves a priority in the life of your family? How often do you pray together? How often do you talk about the things of God together? Are there things that regularly and habitually take priority over God in the life of your family? Priority number one, family priorities, is that we are to love God exclusively and be totally devoted to Him. Maybe a great step to take this new year is to say, God, what are some things in our family life that maybe is distracting us for loving you the way that you deserve, exclusive and total devotion? And then taking steps to intentionally talk about God and pray for one another, and cutting out things if you need to that will help you to put more focus and priority back on where God is. Now, extended family, you are not out of this equation as well, because if we think about this context again in Deuteronomy, right? They were living in this farming community with their relatives. They were living on the same plot of land, often living in close proximity with extended family members. And so I think this also applies to grandparents, aunts and uncles. That faith transmission within the context of the family isn't just the parents, but it's also the extended family as well. My grandfather, for example, he was a major faith influencer in my life. You know, my grandpa, when I was reading this passage and preparing for this, I couldn't help but read what it says in verse 6. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. That was my grandpa. I mean, my grandpa, whenever I saw him, he would always talk about the Bible. Now, he didn't just go, okay, now today I'm going to talk to you from Isaiah 56. Listen up. No, he didn't do that. It was internalized, right? It was on his heart. And so my grandpa, what he did was he would just tell stories. He would bring the Bible to life, and he would bring Jesus into that conversation, and he would talk about my need to have Jesus as my Savior. My grandfather was a major faith influence in my life. And maybe you're a grandparent as well, and you're doing some of those things. God bless you. Keep it up. If you're an aunt and an uncle, what power you have in the life of your nieces, your nephews, to bring up godly conversation to the life, talking to them about Jesus and what he has done for you. You have a role to play in bringing Jesus and talking about him and transferring that faith into the next generation of believers. And so I want to encourage us. Don't just, think, oh, it's just up to the parents. No, we all have a role to play to that in our families. Are you making faith a priority in your time with your kids, your nieces, your nephews, your great-grandkids, your grandkids? Are you making faith a priority? So we talked about priorities, family priorities, and now the second area is family practices, because our priorities often drive our practices. What do I mean by that? Well, in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus said this, wherever your treasure is, there your heart is also, right? What does that mean? It means your priorities drive your practices. For the people of Israel, their priority number one was to be their love for God, their total and exclusive devotion to him. And that would bleed into the practice of talking about him, transmitting faith to the next generation of believers. And what happens when we see in Judges 2 is what happened? It got out of whack. Priority number one wasn't God anymore. And that led into the practice of not talking about the importance of that faith and transmitting it to the next generation. And there arose a generation who didn't know the Lord or what he had done for the people of Israel. Our priorities drive our practices. I found some interesting, I don't know why my nose is running, sorry, it's gross. There was a study I read, and you can check this out. It's on the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and it was kind of telling. It talked about how adolescents spend their time. Now, this was a little dated. The last data available was like 2013, so I would imagine that some of these numbers have changed. Some I'll comment about, but anyways. But at any rate, what it talked about was, on average, from the survey that they sent out, on average, how much time do adolescents spend doing certain activities? And so one of the most telling statistics I saw was religious activities. On a daily basis, on average, adolescents spend 6 minutes a day on religious activities, and that bumps up to 18 minutes on the weekend. Now, if you do the math, I think I did this all right. I may be wrong, but I think I did it all right. Out of 10,080 minutes in a week devoted to religious activity, there are 66 minutes a week. We're in here for a service of 60 minutes. So that's basically one service a week, and that's the total amount of time that adolescents spend on religious activities a week. But on average, adolescents, teenagers consume about 9.5 hours of media, meaning they're in front of a TV or a computer screen or a smartphone for 9.5, sometimes multiple at the same time, 9.5 hours a day. Sports, 318 minutes a week. I'm actually thinking that's a little higher, but 318 minutes a week devoted to sports, 432 minutes a week devoted to eating. I mean, who doesn't like to eat, right? 66 minutes devoted to religious activities, 432 minutes devoted to eating, and about the same devoted to grooming. Now, which guys we know, the girls are the ones who are driving that one up. It's not the guys. Some guys need to spend a little bit more time on their grooming, but the reality is that we spend a vast amount of time on a lot of different things and very small, minute amounts of time on something that has eternal significance, right? Our priorities drive our practices. Now, I'm not saying this. I'm not saying that, the more that we're involved and we could spend hours and hours and hours each week in church and church-related activities, and that's going to make us somewhat more holier or more mature spiritually. Well, we hope that it will make you more mature spiritually, but that's not necessarily the case. More time in doing something doesn't necessarily equate that out, and I'm not saying that you have to be doing all this, but the reality is that priorities drive our practices. And it seems from this data that priority of faith is not relevant to the adolescent life. And ultimately, this is telling in our family life as well, because we often learn our habits, our practices from our upbringing. Why do I say that? In the not too distant past, average church attendance to be considered a regular attender was every week, attending at least one church-related function every week. Today, talking to multiple church leaders, average attendance is considered to be 2 times a month. That's average attendance. Following that trend, what's that going to look like in the next 10 to 20 years? Our priorities drive our practices. Again, I'm not saying church attendance equates to more holiness or church attendance equals more spiritual, development. What I'm saying is, what is our practices teaching the next generation? What are your family practices in transmitting faith? How do your current practices reveal your family's faith priorities? Maybe something to consider this new year is to make more of a family faith practice in your life, to devote more time together, to make more of a priority in your life, to make room, carve out time, do what it takes to make our priority line up with our practices. So we saw that first important influencer that the Bible talks about in transmitting faith, that's the family, right? And we saw how that played out in our family, our priorities and our family practices. We saw that in the life of the people of Israel. Their priority number 1 was to be their love for God, their total and exclusive devotion to Him. That would bleed into the practice of transmitting the importance of that faith to the next generation. So that was first important influencer in transmitting faith is family. The second important influencer is the faith community. The second important influencer is the faith community. Now we're just going to skip ahead one chapter to Deuteronomy 7. Reading in verses 6 through 8. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for His treasured possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. It was not because you were more in number than any other people that the Lord set His love on you and chose you, for you were the fewest of all peoples, but it is because the Lord loves you and is keeping the oath that He swore to your fathers, that the Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So Deuteronomy, this whole book that we call Deuteronomy, was really characterized as Moses' last sermon. It was probably given shortly before his death, and he's addressing the community of Israel, who 40 years previously had rebelled when they came to the doorstep of the promised land and their faith faltered. They rebelled, and so God said, you know what, this first generation that came out of slavery in Egypt, because you rebelled, you didn't trust in the Lord, there's consequences. You're not going to go into the promised land. And so for 40 years, they wandered in the desert where that generation eventually died off, and the next generation came to be. And Moses is instructing, he's teaching the next generation here in Deuteronomy, in the book of Deuteronomy, really. The people of Israel, they were a chosen people. They were holy to God, and their faith wasn't just an individual thing. It was a community thing. That was their identity as a community. And so what I think that this is telling us is that community plays an important role in transmitting faith to the next generation, because faith, it's not lived in a vacuum. We need community. We need the faith community. We need each other because we need one another to encourage us, to challenge us, to surround us, to help us when we're weak, to bring about godly challenge and instruction and edification in our lives. And the New Testament recognizes this as well. When we look at the picture of the early church in Acts chapter 2, we didn't see a bunch of individuals just doing whatever they wanted. We saw a group of people, a community of faith, who every day devoted themselves to prayer, fellowship, and teaching. Titus chapter 1 and Titus chapter 2 gives practical application to the community of faith in challenging the older believers to instruct the new generation of believers to be engaged and involved in transmitting faith to the next generation of believers. I think this is illustrated in recent research that's been put on by the Fuller Youth Institute. And what they found is they were asking the question, what are the characteristics that make faith stick in the life of a student as they grow into adulthood? What are the common threads? What are the common characteristics? How do we make faith stick? And in the book Sticky Faith, they unfold this in a series of different things. But what they found is that multiple adult faith influencers in the lives of kids as they grew led to a faith that stuck. Other than parents, the studies concluded 5 to 6 additional adults that poured into the lives of students as they grew, that those people helped that faith to stick with those kids as they reached into adulthood. In giving that practical advice to parents in that book, Sticky Faith, the authors encourage parents to develop a sticky web of relationships for their students so that their faith would stick with them, or more probability of that faith would stick with them as they reach adulthood. Now, I think it's really simple for us to apply this. And I want to address 2 different groups of people. First, I want to address families, obviously. Yes, families, you are the primary, the first, the most influencing group of people in the life of your student, in the life of your child, in the life of your teenager. You have the most influence, and you are the best youth leader that your kids can have. But what we see here is that the faith community has a role to play as well. Our ministries here don't exist to take that job from you, because time is influence and we don't have much of it. Our role in our children's ministry, our youth ministry, our Awana ministry is to partner with you, to encourage you, to resource you, to equip you, to also provide a sticky web of relationships, a pool of people who have been vetted, who have been approved, who want to engage and have a passion and a desire to reach the next generation. We provide that for you. And so my encouragement for you is allow us to partner with you, because it's a two-way road. We can provide that, but unless you allow us to partner with you, that's not going to happen, right? So my encouragement to you, allow us to partner with you. Partner with your church family to help increase the likelihood that the kind of faith that you want to see in your kids as they go into adulthood, that type of faith will stick with them when they get older. In church family, we have an important role, an important job to do. Because the reality is that, we have a role to fill in this process. The community of faith has a role to play. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking I'm going to say, you need to serve in youth ministry. You need to serve in children's ministry or Awana, and you'd be wrong, because that's not what I'm saying. If you don't have a gift, a passion, an ability to serve in those capacities, then you would be more harm than good. We don't need warm bodies. But we all have a role to play as a church body in passing on and transmitting faith to the next generation. You might be thinking, okay, I'm a greeter, I'm hospitality, I make coffee, I'm an usher, I collect the offering, or I bring people to their seats. You play just as an important role as a youth leader, a children's ministry worker, an Awana worker. Why? Because you help create an environment here where people feel welcomed, where they feel welcomed enough to bring their kids, and they feel safe that they can partner with us, where their kids go to a children's ministry classroom, they hear the gospel. Where their parents come to this service and they hear the gospel, they interact with other believers, they're encouraged, and where faith transformation occurs, and it can radically change the trajectory of a family. We have a role to play as a church. Now, again, I'm going to go back to what I asked earlier. I don't know about you, but I don't want it to be said of us as a church, not here, but universally at this time, at this place. I don't want it to be ever said of us that we allowed a generation to arise who didn't know the Lord. I hope that you have that same desire as well. I titled the message, There Arose Another Generation. I want to highlight these two important influencers that we see in the Bible when it comes to transmitting faith to the next generation. And so the first influencer we saw was families. And we saw that family, time is influence. Parents, you have tons of time. You have 3,000 hours on average a year with your kids. Time is influence. You are influencer number one. And it plays out, and it really plays out in our family priorities, in our family practices. And that second influencer is our faith community. That we need a sticky web of relationships that helps faith to stick in the lives of students as they grow into adulthood. And we can provide that here as a faith community, whether we're serving in, greeting, whether we're serving in children's ministry, whether we're, making coffee, whether we're bringing people to their seats or even setting up chairs throughout the week. We have a role to play in that. So going back to the opening illustration, when we talked about the Inuit, a generation of them who are in danger of losing this capacity that has intrigued scholars for centuries because it's not being passed to the next generation. We look in Judges chapter 2 and we saw the people of Israel who, allowed a generation to come up who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done because they failed to pass on that priority and that importance and practice in their life. And today we're facing the first post-Christian culture, a culture that shows signs that faith transmission is not occurring or isn't effective. For us to pass on faith, we must have a faith of our own. Maybe you're saying, you know what, Tyler, I don't know if I have a faith of my own. Or maybe you're saying, you know what, I've not really made this a priority in my family and we haven't really done this stuff and I'm feeling like kind of convicted about that. The great news is start now. I don't think it's ever too late to start. So start now. But maybe you're saying, you know what, Tyler, the first step is maybe you're saying, I don't have a faith that I can transmit to the next generation. I'm not effective in that. I don't have that story in my life. Well, it's as easy as A, B, C, D. A, we have to admit that we're sinners. The Bible tells us each and every one of us, we're all sinners in word, thought, and deed, that no one is perfect, no one has it all together. We all have sin, and sin separates us from God. So we have to admit that we're sinners. We have to admit that we're not perfect, that we're broken people. B, we have to believe that Jesus died for us. That's why he came. Jesus wasn't born so that we could give presents and all that kind of stuff, although that's great. Jesus was born to die for our sins. And we have to believe that Jesus died for us. We have to call on Jesus for salvation. It's not about the good things that we can do to outweigh the bad. That's not going to cut it. It's not going to bridge that gulf, that chasm that sin has caused in separating us from God. It's only by believing that Jesus died for us on the cross, that his shed blood can bring us back into that relationship with God. So we have to call on Jesus for salvation. The Bible promises us that anyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. That's a promise we can take to the bank. Indeed, we have to decide to follow Jesus. It's a choice. It's a choice that we all have to make. It can't be a choice that someone else makes for us. We all have to make that choice. We have to decide. It's a free gift. It's offered to everyone. We can either choose to accept that gift or to reject it, but it's a choice we have to make. And so we have to decide to follow Jesus. Maybe you're saying, you know what, Tyler? I have never done that. I have never decided to follow Jesus. I've never asked for that free gift of salvation, but I want to today. Or maybe you're saying, you know what? God has not been priority number one in my life, and I want to repent from that. I want to make him priority number one because I want my priorities to drive my practices in my life, in the life of my family. Maybe that's you. I'm going to ask with all eyes closed and heads bowed. If you're saying any of those things, one, man, I've never accepted that free gift, but I want to. Or two, God hasn't been a priority in my life, and I want to repent from that. I want to make him priority number one. If that's you, I'm not going to do anything to embarrass you, to call out your name or call you forward. I'm not going to do any of that. But if that's you, I want to encourage you to raise up your hand. Thank you. Any others? Well, if you raised your hand, I want to encourage you to pray a prayer or something like this in the privacy of your seat, the privacy of your heart. Lord Jesus, I admit that I'm broken. I admit that I'm a sinner. I believe that you died for me. And I want to call on you to be priority number one in my life. God, I thank you that you came to die for me and that you love me, that you call me your child. And so, Lord, I pray, help me to live for you and to make you priority number one in my life. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.